Hi everyone, my name is Shif. I'm a full stack software engineer at Amenity Analytics, where I write UI across several applications using React. I mostly write functional components with React hooks, but I also maintain legacy code written with class components. I was told to put my Twitter handle on the deck, but the truth is I don't tweet much, but here you have it anyways. So today we're going to do a deep dive into UseEffect dependencies. We all know UseEffect, right? It's one of the most common React hooks. We are using UseEffect to run side effects in functional components. The effect runs if something that the effect depends on has changed. We specify what effect we want to run, and we specify a dependencies array. Every time any of the dependencies changes, the effect will run. Also, the effect always runs after the first time the components render. Now, if we leave the dependencies array empty, the effect will only run after the first time the component renders, and that's it. But why is that? Between one render to the next, React checks if anything in the dependencies array has changed. And if the array is empty, nothing inside it can change. So that's why the effect will not run again after the first render if the dependencies array is empty. Sounds simple, right? Actually, it's not always so clear what goes into the dependencies array and why. Let's see an example. I have created this little super simple social networking app. It really cares about your privacy. So all it shows is just your username. And I've got a bunch of users. The app is really made of just two small components, the app component and a user card component. This is the app component. It takes an array of user IDs and renders a user card for each user ID. And this is the user card component. It receives a user ID as a prop. Then we fetch the user's details from the backend with that user ID. And then we can display the username in the card. And I also want to log each time the component renders, just to keep track of things. Now, we want to fetch the user just once. So we call the function fetchUser inside a UseEffect, and we give it an empty array of dependencies, which, as we know, will cause the effect to run only after the first render. And that's it. Which is what we want, right? We only want to fetch the user once. So why are we getting this lint warning? This fuzzy yellow line under the empty dependencies array? The linter is telling us that the fetchUser function should be one of the dependencies for the UseEffect. Now that's annoying because this function isn't changing. It always has the same logic. Get the user's details from the server. It's the same logic every time. So how can it change? To understand this, it helps to look at how the component renders over time. Let's take a look at 2 consecutive renders. Now, let's say for the first render, the component renders with user ID equal 1. And then for the next render, the user ID somehow changes to this ugly string. In React, the props stay constant during each render. So for the first render, React will create the first instance of the user card component with the fetch user function using this URL in it. So it's going to be a constant URL. And then for the second render, React will create another instance of the user card component with the updated user ID and with a different fetch user function with a different URL. Each time the component renders, React takes the user ID from the props and recreates the fetch user function. And therefore, this function does change from one render to another. And that's why the linter is telling us to put the fetch user function as a dependency for the UseEffect. Fine. So now we put the fetch user function as a dependency in our UseEffect, but the linter is still not happy. Now the whole fetch user function is marked as problematic. Let's see what the linter has to say. Remember, we said React recreates the fetch user function for every render. So since the function changes every render, and it is in the dependencies array, our effect will also run every render, which is totally not what we want. Not only we will go fetch the user from the server every render, we also call setUser inside the fetchUser function to set the user using the useState hook, which in turn triggers the component to render again, which makes the effect run again, which sets the user again, which triggers another render, which makes the effect run again. And now we are in an infinite loop of renders. Now, while your app keeps re-rendering, it might not be interactive, and your users will not understand why, because it looks like everything already loaded. Also, fetching data from the server usually costs money. And if you're using a third-party API, you might also surpass your quota and lose access to the API. I actually lost an API key this way once. Luckily, it was a free API. Okay, so let's move the fetch user function inside the UseEffect callback according to the linter suggestion. Now, the benefit of moving the fetch user function into the UseEffect is that now it's very clear that the effect depends on the user ID prop. And indeed, we see this another linter warning telling us to include the user ID in the dependencies array, which makes a whole lot of sense now, right? So now the UseEffect has exactly the dependencies that it needs, which is the user ID prop. So what did we learn? Functions that use props do change. Their code belongs inside the UseEffect. And this way, it is much more clear what really needs to go in the dependencies array. Thank you so much. That's it for me. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions.